Welcome to Discovering Joy with Roy, Part 2, the Beatitudes. I'm Roy, and today's Beatitude is the fifth one. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. In the previous Beatitude, justice, synonym for righteousness, was our subject. Justice is getting what's coming to you. Mercy, today's subject, is getting better than what's coming to you, better than you deserve. There's a well-worn story of the notorious 19th century Mexican bank robber Jorge Rodriguez. He's holding up yet another bank, and this time a Texas Ranger who's been following him actually witnesses the robbery and then follows Rodriguez back across the border to a cantina where the hustler is relaxing with a drink. The Ranger draws his .45, takes his bead, and says, "I know who you are, Rodriguez. I know what you've been doing, and unless you give back all the money you've taken from these banks, I'm going to blow your brains out." But Rodriguez doesn't understand a word of English. No problem. Before the thief can say, "No comprendo," a timid-looking Mexican speaks up. "I know both languages. I'll translate for you," he says. And with that, he turns and tells Rodriguez in Spanish what the Ranger had said in English. Well, the bank robber knows he's been caught fair and square. So he tells the translator in Spanish, "Tell the Ranger I want to live, that I haven't spent a single cent of that money. If he'll go to the town well, face north and count down 7 stones, there'll be a loose one. Pull it out, and behind it, he will find all the money I've taken." The little Mexican turns back to the Ranger and translates. "Jorge Rodriguez is a brave man. He says he is ready to die." Where there is greed, mercy is not to be found. My mother was always a proper lady. Her children never heard her swear. Her strongest expletive was, "Merciful heavens." She was never known to utter a single merciful earth. Neither has anyone else used it as far as I can tell. For mercy, you look upward, from whence cometh your help. You don't look earthward. Earthlings aren't big on mercy. If it's true that saints, the just, the righteous, live on a plane above the rest of us, then the merciful are on the highest level of all. They not only work for a just society, but they labor to make life better for others, even if they don't deserve it. I was inspired years ago by a woman named Christy. She was a part of a group who regularly visited terminally ill AIDS patients in Washington, D.C. This was in the early 1980s, when America was in a panic over the disease. Victims were isolated. Even medical personnel were afraid of physical contact with them. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? The patients had moved away from their families. They had no visitors, none, that is, except Christy and her friends. They came bringing smiles, and postage stamps, and stationery, books, tapes, and cookies, and mercy. They quietly shared their faith. Several of the patients accepted Christ as Savior. In a prayer memo that Christy wrote, she said, "They are socially unacceptable because of their lifestyle, medically unacceptable because of their diseases. They're scared. They're dying. They're unsaved." She thought those were reasons enough to take care of them. Was she afraid? She was asked. No. We believe we are doing the will of God. Now, in the early 1980s, hers was a pretty heroic attitude. Because at the same time, many preachers were thundering in their pulpits that AIDS was God's vengeance on homosexuals. They were getting what they deserved, the preacher said. But Christy and her friends were giving them better than they deserved, in the spirit of the Apostle Paul, who wrote, "Christ died for the ungodly. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." One of my heroes is a man whom Jesus also admired. Although he only lived in a good story, we call it the parable of the Good Samaritan. He is as well celebrated a personality as any historical figure you can name. He's the man we'd all like to have around when we're in trouble. He's given his name to merciful benefactors everywhere. They are Good Samaritans. Margaret Thatcher, the longtime British Prime Minister, discounted his reputation a little. She insisted no one would remember the Good Samaritan if he had only had good intentions. But he also had money. I think the Iron Lady was too cynical. Lots of people have the money. What they don't have is the character to be merciful. The Good Samaritan practiced the love that we Christians talk about, but usually fall short of practicing. We've all traveled lonely roads and seen the victims of life's brutality. And like the priest and the Levite in the parable, we've crossed to the other side. We too were in a hurry, thought it would be too dangerous to stop and help. And undoubtedly the man got what he had coming to him, etc., etc., etc. In my lifetime, the most famous Good Samaritan was Mother Teresa, the young nun who left her native Albania to devote the rest of her life to the poor and dying in Calcutta. Tales of her missions of mercy are recounted worldwide. Most of them are true. Some, like this one, probably aren't, but they capture the truth about her. In this story, Mother Teresa is dressing the wounds of a dying leper. An American tourist watches her for a while, and then he asks her permission to take a picture. And when he draws close enough to frame the scene, the tourist is repulsed by the blood, the smell, and the leper's disfigurement. "Sister," he confessed, "I wouldn't do what you're doing for $10 million. Neither would I, my friend. Neither would I." Another American, and this story is true, was visiting Mother Teresa and inspired, yet uneasy in the presence of such loving care, he confessed, "I'm typical of many Americans who want to stop hunger and pain, but who feel overwhelmed by the bigness of the problems." She pointed her finger and spoke intensely. "Tell your American friends they don't have to go around the world to find people who suffer. In America, there are many needs. People are lonely. They feel alienated. Some people are so lonely they want to die. They need love, especially the old people. If we have Jesus' love, we must share it." Her point is scriptural. Mercy leads to ministry. As in the case of the Apostle Paul, who locates the motivation for his life's work in God's mercy. For he says, "Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart." Since through God's mercy. What motivates Paul motivates most Christians, doesn't it? From God's mercy have come our various ministries. From our ministries, others will receive mercy. Now, where does this mercy come from? I think it comes from empathy. That is the ability to feel another's pain. Why, when others stepped around the victim on the road to Jericho, did the Good Samaritan come to his rescue? Surely he too had pressing appointments. No doubt he could tell that the victim was a Jew, and the racial animosity between Jews and Samaritans was deep and bitter. Don't you imagine he was as reluctant as anyone else to become involved? So why did he do it? My guess is that his benevolence grew out of personal experience. He'd been a victim himself, so he understood. Jesus had been warned about Samaritans all his life. They were a despised race. As an alien among foreigners, the Samaritan was no stranger to mental and perhaps even physical abuse. He may even have been rescued in the past by some merciful soul, perhaps. One would like to think, maybe even by a sympathetic Jew. His empathy drove him to action. But sometimes, even if you can't do anything to help, empathy is enough by itself. A little girl was pretty late getting home from school. And when she arrived, her mother wanted to know why she was so late. She said, I had to help another girl. She was in trouble. "What did you do to help her?" "Oh, I sat down and helped her cry." Her mother would understand. I'm afraid I, a typical male, would have asked 1,000 questions. What was wrong with her? What was the problem? Should we go back and do something for her? Tears alone would have exasperated me, I'm afraid. What good would that do? But I confess, after years of living as a husband and a father, I've been taught better. Sometimes an empathetic heart, expressed in a good shared cry, is all that's needed. It's virtually impossible to discuss this subject without mentioning another of my heroes, Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War president's compassion has been talked about often in wonderment that a politician should have had such a servant's heart. Well, here's one such story. In 1833, Lincoln was on an excursion aboard the steamer Hartford. He spotted a narrow iron-bound door he hadn't seen before, and he asked about it. That's a sweat box, he was told. 3 foot by 3 foot, poorly ventilated cubicle. Its stifling steam heat could quickly tame a rebellious sailor. Thousands of American seamen were sent to the sweat box every year. The president was curious. He doffed his hat, gave orders to open at a signal from him, and then Lincoln, who stood well over 6 feet tall, folded himself into the box. The door was shut behind him. Steam quickly poured in. And after just 3 minutes, he signaled to be released. Enough was enough. When he got out, he gave Secretary of Navy Gideon Welles a strict order. In the future, the sweatbox should never be allowed on any American ship. And in just a few years, Great Britain, France, Germany, and other European countries followed the example. The president's experience gave him a new empathy for suffering seamen. His empathy led him to take action. That's how mercy works. That's a big gesture that I just talked about, but usually mercy does simple, little things. The merciful don't go in for the grand statement. They do what they can with what they have. Whether they are noticed or not doesn't concern them. I was once at a Food for the Hungry seminar. The presenter was a veteran of many years of famine relief. And someone in the audience asked him, "How do you handle compassion fatigue?" It's a good question. It's been raised a lot in recent months as COVID-19 pandemic has worn out so many medical workers, and ambulance drivers, and first responders, and hard-pressed workers in so many fields. In fact, while I was preparing this talk, I was interrupted by a Zoom call with some dear friends. One of them manages a nursing home in one of America's hardest hit states. He's just worked 60, 10 to 12-hour days, no day off. There's more to come. 71 of his 220 residents have battled the virus. 63 of his 325 employees have been out with it. The death rate among his patients is double that of a year ago. He's exhausted. I didn't ask him how he handled compassion fatigue. I already knew. In that seminar so many years ago, the presenter answered, "You simply do what you can." And then he quoted Larry Ward, who had founded Food for the Hungry. He put it this way: it comes down to one life. People die one at a time. We help them one at a time. That's what my friend and his team are doing in this pandemic, offering mercy to one person at a time. Mercy may lie in something you don't do also, in the embarrassing picture you don't take, or the rumor you don't repeat. I sometimes feel like begging our intrusive television and social media, have mercy. Your obsession with people's failures and shortcomings, I want to say to them, is downright cruel. I can remember a kinder, more merciful era. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was our president. What I didn't know as a young kid was that the president was crippled. He couldn't stand or walk on his own. I don't think he could be elected today. The media would take every opportunity to show his disability. But then newsmen turned away when he fell. They didn't show him laboriously trying to stand. They didn't focus on his leg braces. They didn't insist the public has a right to know. They showed him mercy. Mercy is always something beautiful. There's an unforgettable line in a novel by Henry James called The Ambassadors. He's describing a woman that he says is so graceful, that when she touches a thing, the ugliness, God knows how, goes out of it. That's how mercy works. The careful Samaritan, gently attending the man's ugly wounds, lifted him onto his own donkey, arranged for his stay in the inn, paid for the room, assumed any additional expenses. His every merciful act a thing of beauty. If the Good Samaritan's tenderness weren't so rare, there wouldn't be a story here. But mercy is, I'm sorry to say, so beautiful in large measure because it's so unusual. Jesus wouldn't have bothered to commend merciful people if they were commonplace. But mercy is just not something we expect from one another. We've hardened ourselves. We have to look out for number one, we're taught, because we're convinced that no one else will. When someone does us a small favor, we hardly know how to act. I observed a woman sitting in a wheelchair at the airport gate. The attentive attendant assured her she would be taken to the plane ahead of the rest of the passengers and assisted into her seat. And then when the plane landed, she'd be met by another attendant with a wheelchair. She didn't have to worry about a thing. And the lady said, "How nice of you to care for me without my having to pay extra." And she thanked her. Blessed are the merciful. They don't expect extra pay. As far as Jesus is concerned, the priest and the Levite in the parable of the Good Samaritan represent religion, but the Samaritan represents God. Jesus is answering the question, who's my neighbor? What makes his story unforgettable, though, is his portrait of this unexpectedly gracious Samaritan who is, well, so much like God. The Bible is replete with references to God's mercy, for he is graceful and merciful, Nehemiah says. And King David, no stranger to human violence, confided to his prophet Gad, "I'm in deep distress. Let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is very great. But do not let me fall into the hands of men." Men would attack him, he knew. But God would protect even as he protects us. Here's a verse that we learned as children. "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." He is, after all, the one of whom John writes, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." What greater example of mercy has there ever been? In this, as in God's other virtues, we are to imitate God. "I desire mercy," Jesus says, "not sacrifice, for I have come to call the righteous. But I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And he has also said, "He has showed you, O man," let me quote this one from Micah, and it's exemplified by Jesus. "He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." And what of the promise that the merciful shall receive mercy? Not much needs to be said, does it? The amazing thing about the gospel is this: even before we try out this mercy thing, we're aware of something else that we can't overlook. We have already received mercy from God, who saves and blesses us. And compared with what we have received, our little acts of kindness and of love seem pretty small, don't they? So we who have received so much give what we can. And as our acts of mercy increase, so does our joy. I bid you joy.